The tent they'd rented for the occasion was the kind that comes with chandeliers. I know because I helped coordinate the delivery, not the tent company itself, but the refrigerated catering trucks that circled the Crane property on Ridgewood Drive that Saturday afternoon, and the temperature-controlled van carrying the seafood towers from a place in Midtown that charged $400 per arrangement. I knew the route. I'd mapped it myself 3 days before, the way I map every route that matters. I wasn't supposed to be there. That's the part I still think about. I had no invitation, no seat assignment, no name on any list. What I had was 11 years of watching a man build something extraordinary in silence, and the particular patience that comes from watching long enough to know when silence has run out of road. The party was for Sterling Crane, Harvard MBA, class of 2025, 26 years old, recently photographed for a regional business quarterly under the headline Next Generation Leadership. 80 guests had been invited to the Crane family property, a colonial revival on 4 acres that Garrett Crane had purchased in 2003, the year Hollis turned 17. The catering was handled by a firm from Short Hills. The bar was open at 4. By 6. When I arrived, the tent was warm and loud, and full of the particular energy of people celebrating something they hadn't personally earned. I came in through the side entrance, near the kitchen corridor. A young woman with a clipboard looked at me, and I told her I was with Ironclad. She checked her list, didn't find the name, and then her earpiece crackled and she turned away. I walked through. The first thing I saw was Hollis. He was sitting at a table in the back row, the last table before the tent wall, set slightly apart from the others, the way overflow seating gets arranged when the guest list expands at the last minute. There was a glass of water in front of him, untouched. He was wearing a dark jacket I recognized from a site visit we'd done together in Elizabeth 2 winters ago. He was watching the room the way he always watches rooms, not scanning, not searching, just absorbing, taking inventory. I had worked alongside Hollis Crane for 11 years. I knew what that expression meant. It meant he was counting something. Garrett Crane was at the front of the tent, standing beside a table where Sterling sat with 3 friends from business school. Garrett is 63, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who fills a room without trying or without noticing that he's doing it. He had a microphone. He had notes, though he barely looked at them. He had been speaking for what I later estimated, based on when I entered and when he finally sat down, to be approximately 12 minutes. I counted 43 times that he said Sterling's name. I was not counting when I walked in. I started counting about 90 seconds after I arrived, once I understood what kind of speech this was. It was the kind a father gives when he has decided, publicly and permanently, what kind of son he has. Garrett described Sterling's thesis defense. He described a phone call Sterling had made from Cambridge to discuss market positioning. He described, and this is the moment I remember most clearly, the morning Sterling had walked into Crane Industrial's office at 19 years old, and Garrett had thought, this is who carries it forward. Sterling was 19 in 2018. Hollis was 31 in 2018. In 2018, Hollis had been operating Ironclad Logistics for 4 years, had 17 trucks running routes through Newark and Elizabeth, and had just signed the contract that would eventually make Crane Industrial his single largest account. Garrett didn't say Hollis's name once. Not once in 12 minutes. Not in the acknowledgments. Not in the family remarks. Not in the section where he listed the people who had shaped Sterling's path. He mentioned his late wife. He mentioned his own father. He mentioned a professor at Harvard whose name I didn't catch. He did not mention his older son, who was sitting 12 feet behind the last row of guests, in a jacket I recognized, drinking nothing, watching everything. Then Garrett announced the gifts. A Tesla Roadster, he said the number $90,000, and the room responded with the particular sound of people who are impressed but pretending not to be. A property in the Hamptons, $12 million. Which Garrett described as a place for the next chapter, and the vice presidency at Crane Industrial Coatings, effective the 1st of September, with full operational authority over the Eastern Distribution Network. The Eastern Distribution Network that Ironclad Logistics services under a contract worth $2.1 million annually. I looked at Hollis when Garrett said that. Hollis didn't move. His hands were flat on the table. He was still watching his father the way a surveyor watches a horizon, not with feeling, just with precision. I had been trying to get him to walk into this room for 4 years. I had made the argument every way I knew how. He had refused every time, in the same quiet voice, with the same answer, "Not yet, Marin. Not like this." I walked toward Garrett Crane. He saw me coming. He had the expression of a man who doesn't recognize a face but knows it doesn't belong. He said, not unkindly, "Can I help you?" I said, "My name is Marin Buckley. I'm the co-founder of Ironclad Logistics. I need to speak with you about Crane Industrial's largest vendor relationship." The room was still loud. Most people hadn't noticed, but Sterling had. And behind me, at the back table, I knew without turning around that Hollis had gone completely still. I need to write part 2/7, the flashback section. This is told from Marin's POV she's narrating, so the flashback is what she learned about Hollis's past things he told her over the years, or that she pieced together. The section needs to cover 9-year-old Hollis diagnosed with dyslexia, Garrett calling him the anchor, the kitchen door conversation, Sterling as the sale, Hollis leaving at 19 with $1,200, target 1,256 words. He told me the kitchen door story once, just once, and not the way people tell stories they want you to remember. He said it the way you mention a scar when someone accidentally touches it quickly, without ceremony, already moving on before the words finished landing. We were in the Ironclad office on Frelinghuysen Avenue, late on a Thursday in February 2017. The heat was unreliable that winter, and we'd both kept our coats on. Hollis was going through a carrier contract on his laptop, turning the screen slightly toward me every few minutes so I could read the clauses he'd flagged. He worked that way with documents pointing, letting me read aloud if we needed to talk through the language. We had built a system by then without ever naming it. He said, without looking up from the screen, "My father had a word for me when I was a kid. He called me the anchor." I didn't say anything. I had learned, by then, that silence was the correct response when Hollis started a sentence that way. "Sterling was the sail," he said. That was the other half of it. Sterling catches the wind, moves things forward. The anchor just sits there and drags. He turned the screen back toward himself and kept reading. That was the whole story, that night, but over the years, in pieces. I got the rest of it. What follows is what Hollis told me, not in one sitting, not in order, but accumulated across 7 years of shared offices and long drives, and the particular honesty that comes from working alongside someone long enough that the past stops feeling like something that needs to be protected. I have tried to keep it in his words where I can. Where I can't, I've kept it in his logic, which is the closest thing to the same. In 1997, Hollis was 9 years old. The school had been raising concerns for 2 years. By then, his reading was slow, his written work inconsistent, his test scores scattered in ways his teachers couldn't explain by effort or attention alone. His mother, Ruth, had pushed for a formal evaluation. Garrett had resisted, the way Garrett resisted most things that required him to sit in a room and be told something he didn't already know. The evaluation came back in October of that year. Dyslexia. Moderate to significant, the report said, affecting phonological processing and reading fluency. The specialist explained it in terms of how the brain routes information, how some pathways work differently, how with the right support and time, most children with dyslexia develop strong compensatory strategies and go on to, Garrett said, so the boy will never read like a normal child. The specialist said that wasn't quite the right framing. Garrett said, "That's the framing I'm working with." He said it. Hollis told me years later. Not cruelly. That was the thing that stayed with him. His father hadn't said it to wound him. He'd said it the way a contractor marks a load-bearing wall. This is what we're dealing with. This is the structural fact. Now let's figure out what we can and cannot build around it. The diagnosis was not a tragedy in Garrett Crane's mind, it was a specification. And Garrett Crane had looked at the specification and concluded, with the same efficiency he applied to everything, that certain outcomes were now off the table. He did not ask what outcomes might still be on it. The kitchen door was hollow core, the kind that doesn't muffle much. Hollis was 11, maybe 12. He'd been upstairs and come down for water, and he'd stopped in the hallway because he could hear his parents' voices, and something in the register of them made him stop. His father was talking about Sterling. Sterling was 8, already reading 2 grade levels ahead, already showing the particular kind of confidence that comes from being told, repeatedly and sincerely, that you are exactly what was hoped for. Garrett was laying out the future with the precision of a man who believed futures could be laid out Harvard, business school, a position at Crane Industrial that would become a leadership position, that would eventually become the top position. Sterling would take the company into its next phase. Sterling had the mind for it, the temperament, the presence. Ruth said, "What about Hollis?" There was a pause, not a long one. Garrett said, "Hollis is the anchor, Sterling is the sail. That's just how it is. Ruth, Sterling moves us forward. Hollis is what he is." Ruth said, "He's 10 years old." Garrett. 11, Garrett said. "And dyslexia doesn't improve with age. His reading is still 2 years behind. His math is average. His teachers say he's cooperative but doesn't retain. He just needs more time." "Time doesn't fix the wiring," Garrett said. "Does time fix character?" Ruth didn't answer that. Hollis stood in the hallway until he was sure they had moved to another subject. Then he went back upstairs without the water. He lay in the dark for a long time. He told me he wasn't crying, and I believed him, because the way he described it wasn't the way people describe crying. He said he was doing the math. He said he was figuring out what the number meant, not whether it was fair, not whether it hurt, but what it actually meant for what he would and wouldn't do next. That, I think, is the thing about Hollis that his father never understood and could not have understood, because understanding it would have required seeing something he had already decided wasn't there. Hollis's brain did not process text the way most brains did. It processed pattern. It processed space and sequence, and the relationship between moving parts. The same wiring that made a page of print shimmer and rearrange itself made a logistics network with its interdependencies, its timing tolerances, its cascade failures readable in a way most people had to work hard to approximate. He saw it the way other people hear music, whole and at once. But you cannot explain that to a man who has already written the specification. He left at 19. It was a Tuesday in March, 2007. He had $1,200 in a checking account money from 18 months of part-time work at a home improvement warehouse in Kearney, stocking shelves on weekend mornings and some weekday evenings after school. He had kept the account in his own name, at a branch his father didn't use, and he had told no one what he was saving toward, because he hadn't known himself until about 3 weeks before he left. He put his things in 2 bags. He came downstairs. Ruth was in the kitchen. She saw his face and understood immediately, the way mothers do, and she started crying before he had said a word. He told her he'd be all right. He told her he'd call when he had an address. He meant both of those things. Garrett was in the study. He came to the doorway when he heard Ruth. He looked at Hollis, at the bags, at the coat already on. He said, "You'll come back when you realize the world isn't as easy as you think." Hollis said, "Okay, Dad." He did not say goodbye. He picked up the bags and walked out. He never came back to ask for anything. Not money, not advice, not the acknowledgement that might have cost his father nothing and meant everything. He had done the math in the hallway when he was 11, and the answer had not changed. The anchor doesn't ask the sail for permission to hold. I walked out of that house on a Tuesday in March, he told me once, in the Frayling-Huisen office, late on a night when neither of us had anywhere else to be. I did not look back at the window. I knew Ruth would be standing there. I knew Garrett would not. That was the last information I needed. He said it without drama. He said it the way he said most things that mattered as a fact. Already processed, already filed. I wrote nothing down. Some things you don't need to write down. The rest of it, the warehouse, Cyrus, the first truck he told me over years, in the way I described. I am putting it in order here because order is what I can offer. Hollis never told it in order. He told it the way freight moves, by the most efficient route, not the most sentimental one. For the first 8 months, I worked at a freight consolidation warehouse on Kapkowski Road in Elizabeth, New Jersey, a building the size of a city block that smelled of diesel and shrink wrap and the particular exhaustion of men who had been on their feet since 4 in the morning. I was 25 years old, and I had $200 in a checking account and no plan beyond the next shift. The job paid $14 an hour. I took every overtime hour they offered. What I noticed, almost immediately, was the inefficiency, not in the way a manager notices it with a clipboard and a metric. I noticed it the way you notice a crooked picture frame. Something in the arrangement was wrong, and I couldn't stop seeing it. Trucks were leaving half-loaded. Routes were doubling back on themselves. A shipment going to a warehouse in Linden was sitting on a dock waiting for a full pallet, while a truck to Linden left that same morning with empty space in the rear third. I could see it. Not on paper, I have never been good with paper, but in the air, the way the movement of freight through that building traced a shape I could read the way other people read text. I started writing things down. Not words, I have always been slow with words. Rearranging them in my head before they settle into the right order. The way my third-grade teacher told my mother was a processing difficulty, and my father later translated into something shorter and crueler. I drew maps, rough ones, on the backs of manifests and the inside covers of the notebooks I bought from the dollar bin at the CVS on Elizabeth Avenue. Lines and nodes, clusters of stops that could share a truck if the departure window shifted by 40 minutes. I showed one of these to my supervisor, a man named Delgado who had been at that warehouse for 16 years. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "Where'd you get this?" I told him I drew it. He said, "You drew this yourself." I said yes. He put it in his desk drawer and didn't mention it again. 3 weeks later, the warehouse implemented a revised routing sequence for the northern New Jersey corridor. I recognized the shape of it. Delgado did not mention that either. I was not angry. I filed it as information. It was Cyrus Walden who saw the thing Delgado had put in a drawer. Cyrus was 58 years old and had driven long-haul trucks for 31 years before a back injury retired him to the role of dock coordinator at the same warehouse. He was a large, deliberate man who moved slowly and spoke less than most people were comfortable with. He had driven routes from Newark to Chicago, Newark to Atlanta, Newark to Houston, and he carried that geography in his body the way some people carry music instinctively without needing to read it. He had watched me for about 2 months before he said anything. He said it one morning in November, in the break room, while I was eating a sandwich over one of my maps. He sat down across from me without asking, looked at the map, and said, "You don't read it like everyone else." I said, "Read what?" He said, "The road. You don't read it. You see it." I didn't answer right away. He let the silence sit, which told me he was a man who understood what silence was for. He said, "Most people look at a route and they read it left to right, start to finish. You look at it and you see the whole thing at once, like a picture." He tapped the map with one finger. "That's not a skill they teach. Most dispatchers don't have it. I've worked with maybe 3 people in 30 years who had it." He picked up his coffee. "You're going to waste it here." I told him I didn't have capital. I told him I didn't have a CDL. I told him I had $200 in a checking account and a rented room in Hillside with a window that faced a brick wall. He said, "That's a list of things that can change." Over the next 2 years, Cyrus taught me everything he knew about freight. Not from books. He understood that books were not the fastest way into my head. He taught me by walking routes with me, by drawing on napkins, by sitting in the cab of his old Peterbilt that he kept in a storage lot in Carteret and talking through load optimization the way a chess player talks through a game. He taught me how to read a freight invoice, how to negotiate accessorial charges, how to identify a shipper who would pay for speed and a shipper who would pay for reliability, and how those were not always the same person. He taught me the difference between a carrier that looked cheap on paper and a carrier that was actually cheap, and why that difference would eventually cost a shipper more than the savings were worth. I got my CDL in 2014. I drove for a regional carrier out of Kearney for 2 years after that, taking routes nobody else wanted: the early morning runs, the overnight hauls to distribution centers in Pennsylvania and upstate New York. I saved money with the specific focus of a man who has decided that saving money is a form of argument. By the end of 2016, I had $60,000 in a savings account. I told Cyrus. He said, "Not enough for a Freightliner, not the kind you need." I said I knew. He said, "I have $40,000 I've been deciding what to do with for 3 years. He said it the way he said most things, plainly, without performance. "I'll loan it to you. No interest. Pay me back when you can." I told him I couldn't take it. He said, "You're not taking it. I'm giving it to you as an investment in something I believe in. There's a difference." He looked at me across the table. "Do you know why your father called you an anchor?" I said I had some ideas. He said, "Because he was afraid you'd go somewhere he couldn't follow." He picked up his coffee again. That's what fathers do when they don't understand their sons. They give them names that mean stay. I didn't answer. I looked at the table. Cyrus did not push. In February of 2017, I bought a 2014 Freightliner Cascadia with 140,000 miles on it from a carrier in Parsippany that was downsizing its fleet. I paid $62,000. I had the engine inspected by a mechanic named Darnell, who had worked on long-haul equipment for 20 years and who told me the truck had been maintained correctly and would run for another 400,000 miles if I treated it right. I intended to. I had met Maren Buckley 6 months earlier at an industry networking event in Newark that I attended mostly because Cyrus told me to, and I had learned to treat Cyrus's suggestions as instructions. Maren had been a dispatcher at UPS for 11 years and had recently left after a disagreement with management over routing protocols she believed were costing the company money. She was 31 years old and had the particular impatience of someone who had been right too many times in rooms where being right was not valued. She looked at my routing maps for approximately 4 minutes and said, "Who taught you to do this?" I said, "I taught myself." She said, "That explains why it actually works." We incorporated Ironclad Logistics LLC in March of 2017. The name was her suggestion. She said she wanted something that meant what it meant without needing explanation. I agreed. We opened a business checking account with $11,000 combined and a lease on a small office space on Haynes Avenue in Newark that had previously been occupied by a tax preparation service and still smelled faintly of old paper. Our first contracted haul was a shipment of industrial sealant from a manufacturer in Secaucus to a distribution center in Trenton. The load paid $3,800 after fuel, tolls, my time, and a contribution to the insurance premium. The net was $2,200. I drove it myself. When I got back to Newark and parked the truck, Maren was waiting in the office with 2 cups of coffee from the bodega across the street. She handed me one and said, $2,200. I said, "Yes." She said, "You should call your family." I said, "No." She said, "Hollis, this is something. You built this." I said, "I know what I built." She waited. Maren was good at waiting, though she was less comfortable with it than Cyrus. She held the coffee cup with both hands and looked at me, and I could see her deciding whether to push. She said, "Then why not tell them?" I said, "Because I didn't build it to be recognized. I built it to survive." I looked at the check on the desk. Those are different things. She didn't agree. She also didn't argue. She filed it the way I had filed the routing map in Delgado's drawer as information she intended to return to. By the end of 2017, Ironclad had run 41 contracted hauls. Total revenue $212,000. 3 clients had signed recurring agreements. I had put a down payment on a second truck. By 2020, We had 52 trucks and 3 facilities. Revenue was just under $14 million. The pandemic had been difficult the way every disruption is difficult, but freight had not stopped moving. If anything, it had moved faster and less predictably, which meant carriers who could adapt in real time were suddenly worth considerably more than they had been in February. We adapted. That was what Ironclad did. By the end of 2024, we had 140 trucks, 3 yards, and 212 active clients. Revenue was $38 million. The valuation report said $62 million. Crane Industrial was still our most punctual account. My father still did not know who owned the company that kept his freight moving. The work had been speaking for 4 years. He just hadn't known whose voice it was. Garrett Crane did not know that his eldest son owned a trucking company. He did not know because I had not told him, and because he had not asked. He had not asked because, as far as he was concerned, the question of what I was doing with my life had been answered the morning I walked out of his house with 2 bags and said, "Okay," and nothing else. The anchor doesn't explain itself to the ship. By the end of 2018, Ironclad had 10 trucks on the road and 3 dedicated lanes running between Newark and the Port of Elizabeth. Marin had moved from her kitchen table to an actual office, a converted warehouse unit on Frelinghuysen Avenue with a loading dock we didn't use but liked having. Kevin had gone from part-time to full-time, and we'd hired 2 more dispatchers, a woman named Priya, who had come from a mid-size freight brokerage in Edison, and a man named Dale who had spent 11 years at a regional carrier before they'd folded. Between the 3 of them, they ran the floor from 5 in the morning until midnight. I ran it the other 5 hours. Marin ran it the rest of the time, which meant she ran it constantly because she was the kind of person who checked the board even when she was supposed to be sleeping. I did not sleep much either, but for different reasons. When I drove, which I still did twice a week because I needed to, the road had a way of flattening things out. A long stretch of the turnpike at 3 in the morning. A load of industrial solvents bound for a chemical plant in Bayonne. There was a clarity to it that no office could replicate. I could see the whole pattern of the route in my head before I got there. Marin used to say I was the only person she'd ever met who could look at a dispatch board and immediately find the 3 inefficiencies that everyone else had missed. I told her it wasn't a skill. It was just that my brain had never learned to read things the normal way, so it had learned to read them differently. She said that was the same thing. I didn't argue. By 2020, we had 52 trucks, a second yard in Elizabeth, and a 3rd facility we were leasing in Linden. Our revenue that year was just under $14 million. The pandemic had been difficult in the way that every disruption is difficult, but freight had not stopped moving. If anything, it had moved faster and less predictably, which meant that carriers who could adapt in real time were suddenly worth considerably more than they had been in February. We adapted. We had always adapted. That was what Ironclad did. It read the road conditions, and it moved. Marin handled the growth with the same flat efficiency she'd brought to everything since the beginning. She was not excitable. She did not celebrate milestones the way some people do, with speeches and champagne and a sense of arrival. When we crossed $20 million in revenue, she sent me a text that said 20. When we crossed 30, she said 30. Lunch, I said yes. We ate sandwiches at a diner on McCarter Highway and talked about the Linden facility's drainage problem for 40 minutes. That was the celebration. It was the right kind. In the spring of 2021, a procurement coordinator named Sandra Okafor emailed our sales line requesting a freight quote for regular industrial cargo routes between Newark and 3 distribution points in central Jersey. The company was Crane Industrial Coatings. I was not on that email chain. Marin forwarded it to me with no comment, just the subject line highlighted. I sat with it for 2 days. The name was not a coincidence. It was not a different company with a similar name. It was Garrett Crane's company, the one he had been building for 30 years, the one whose growth he had announced at every dinner table I could remember, the one whose revenue he had cited as evidence of what a man could accomplish when he was not held back. I knew the company the way you know a landmark you've driven past your entire life without ever stopping. I knew its address. I knew its primary product lines. I knew that it had expanded its Newark area distribution in 2019 and that it had been struggling with freight reliability since losing its previous carrier to a bankruptcy the prior fall. I knew these things because I made it my business to know the freight landscape in this corridor, and Crane Industrial was part of that landscape. I called our attorney, a woman named Deborah Finch, who had handled Ironclad's contracts since the second year. I told her I had a situation. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the reasons I had kept her. When I finished, she said, "You want to take the contract?" I said yes. She said, "Under what name?" I told her I would not be the contact on this account. She asked who would be. I told her the account would be managed under the name Asa Trumbull, sales director, and that all correspondence would route through a dedicated email address and a secondary phone line that I would monitor, but that Marin would handle in the event of any direct contact. Deborah was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's not illegal." I told her I knew. She said, "It's also not particularly wise." I told her I knew that too. The contract was signed in June of 2021, $2,100,000 per year, renewable annually, with a 90-day termination clause on either side. Sandra Okafor signed for Crane Industrial. The signature on the Ironclad side read, Asa Trumbull. I was not in the room. Marin handled the closing. She told me afterward that Sandra had been professional and thorough and had asked good questions about our tracking systems and claims resolution process. She had not asked who owned the company. Most procurement coordinators don't. They ask about capacity and rates and on-time delivery percentages. We had good answers to all of those questions. By the end of 2021, Crane Industrial represented roughly 6% of Ironclad's total revenue. By 2023, as we had grown and as Crane Industrial had expanded its shipping volume, that number had shifted. They were moving more freight. We were moving it more efficiently. And the relationship had deepened in the way that good freight relationships do. Quietly and through performance rather than through conversation. The account had become one of our most consistent, not our largest, but among our most reliable in terms of payment timing and volume predictability. Marin managed it with the same precision she applied to everything else. Asa Trumbull responded to emails within the hour. It was Marin who told me about the conversation with the CFO. She had heard it secondhand through Sandra Okafor, who had mentioned it in passing during a quarterly review call. Garrett Crane had apparently told his CFO, a man named Philip Rourke, whom I did not know personally, but whose name appeared on several of the payment authorizations, that he wanted to know who was behind Ironclad. He had said, according to Sandra's account, that he wanted to meet them. That a company this consistent, this operationally clean, was the kind of operation he wanted a relationship with at the ownership level. Philip Rourke had apparently made some inquiries and come back with nothing useful. The ownership of Ironclad was not hidden, exactly, but it was not prominent. My name was not on the website. I did not attend industry events under the company banner. The public filings listed me as the principal, but you had to know to look, and most people don't look unless they have a specific reason. Sandra had told Philip Rourke that Ironclad's ownership preferred to let the work speak for itself and wasn't interested in executive-level meetings. Philip Rourke had apparently relayed this to Garrett Crane. Marin told me that, according to Sandra, his response had been something like, "They just want to work." Fine. They're the best carrier we have. Let them work. Marin told me this on a Wednesday afternoon in the Freilinghuisen office. She had closed the door, which she only did when she wanted to say something she did not want the floor to hear. She sat across from me and said, "Your father is trying to find out who owns this company." I said I knew. She said, "He's going to find out eventually." I said, "Maybe." She said, "Hollis." I said I heard her. She said, "You need to tell him, or you need to end the contract. You can't keep running $2 million a year through a fake name and pretend it's a business decision." I told her it was a business decision. She said it was also something else, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I told her my father would not find out because he was not looking in the right place, and because the people who knew were not going to tell him. She said, "What if I told him?" I looked at her. She said, "I'm not going to, but I want you to understand that I could, and that the longer this goes on, the more it looks like something you're ashamed of instead of something you built. I told her I was not ashamed of anything. She said, "Then act like it." I did not answer her right away. I had been in the business long enough to know that silence makes people say things they would not otherwise say. But Marin had been in the business long enough to know the same thing. So she just waited. We sat across from each other for a while. Through the window, I could see the dispatch floor, Dale at the board, Priya on a headset, 3 new hires whose names I was still learning moving between workstations. 47 of our drivers were on the road at that moment. I knew because I had checked the board before the meeting. I said, "I'm not hiding. I'm preparing." She said, "For what?" I said, "For the moment when the truth has to be complete." She looked at me the way she had looked at me on the day I told her about the dyslexia, when we were still running 2 trucks, and she had asked me why I always read contracts out loud to myself before signing. That look was not pity. It was something closer to recognition. I called Deborah Finch that evening and told her I needed a document package, not for litigation, for disclosure, if it ever came to that. I wanted everything in one place, the original contract, every renewal, every payment authorization from Crane Industrial, every email that had passed between Sandra Okafor and the Asa Trumbull address, every wire transfer record showing $2,100,000 per year moving from Crane Industrial's accounts into Ironclad's operating account. I wanted the full freight performance record, on-time delivery rates, claims history, volume handled. I wanted the $62 million valuation report that our investment bank had prepared the previous fall, the one based on a 1.6 times revenue multiple against $38 million in annual billings. I wanted all of it organized, indexed, and ready. Deborah said, "You're building a case." I said I was building a record. She said those were sometimes the same thing. I told her I knew. When I told Marin what I had asked Deborah to prepare, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What is that for?" I said, "It's for the moment when the truth comes out. When it does, it comes out completely, not in pieces, not with gaps, all of it." She said, "And when is that moment?" I said I didn't know yet. She said, "Hollis." I said I heard her. She said, "I'm not going to wait forever." I told her I understood. She said, "I mean it." I told her I believed her. I did believe her. That was the thing about Marin. She did not make statements she did not intend to keep. She had told me once, in the second year, when a client had tried to renegotiate a signed contract after delivery, that she did not renegotiate and she did not threaten. She just acted. I'd watched her act for 7 years by that point. I had no reason to doubt her. By the end of 2024, Ironclad had 140 trucks, 3 yards, and 212 active clients. Revenue was $38 million. The valuation report said $62 million. Crane Industrial was still our most punctual account. My father still did not know who owned the company that kept his freight moving. He had stopped asking. As far as I could tell, he had accepted the answer he'd been given, that Ironclad preferred to let the work speak for itself. The work had been speaking for 4 years. He just hadn't known whose voice it was. The first time Marin brought it up directly, we were sitting in the dispatch office on Route 1, just past the Elizabeth Interchange. It was January 2021. Outside, a driver named Curtis was backing a Freightliner into Bay 3 with the kind of precision that takes years to learn. Marin had a coffee in one hand and a folder of Q4 numbers in the other, and she set both down on my desk and said, without preamble, "You need to tell them." I didn't ask who she meant. "They'll find out eventually," she said, "and when they do, it won't be on your terms. It'll be on theirs." I told her Crane Industrial had no reason to investigate their logistics vendor. I told her we were a line item in their operations budget, a reliable one, and that reliable line items don't get scrutinized. I told her the work was the answer. She picked up her coffee and looked at me for a long moment. "That's not what I'm worried about," she said. "I'm worried about you." That was the first conversation. There were many more. By spring of 2022, the conversations had a rhythm. Marin would raise it after a board meeting or after a call with the Crane industrial account manager, a man named Phil Decker, who sent her birthday emails and had no idea he was corresponding with the COO of a company his CEO's eldest son had built from a single truck and 40,000 borrowed dollars. She would raise it calmly at first, then with more edge as the weeks passed, and I would listen and give her the same answer in different configurations. They won't cancel. They depend on us. The work speaks for itself. In October of 2022, she stopped being calm about it. "You don't have the right to keep this secret," she said. We were in the parking lot of the Newark yard after a long Thursday. Her car was running. She hadn't gotten in yet. "Your father needs to know. Your family needs to know. You built something that any person with eyes could see is extraordinary. And you're letting it be invisible because why? Because it's convenient. Because it's easier." "Because I didn't build it to be seen by him," I said. She looked at me like I'd said something in a language she almost understood. "That's not an answer," she said. "That's an excuse dressed up as philosophy." I didn't respond. She got in her car. The conversation was over for that night, but it wasn't over. It was never over with Marin. That was one of the things that made her indispensable and, occasionally, exhausting. In the spring of 2023, I drove up to see Cyrus Walden at his place in Parsippany. He was 70 years old by then, retired from driving, living in a house that was too big for one person, but that he refused to downsize because, he said, the extra rooms kept him honest. He still had the photograph of his first rig on the kitchen wall. He made coffee the same way he always had, too strong, left on the burner too long. We sat at his kitchen table and I told him where things stood. The contract. The 4 years. Marin's argument. My answer. He listened without interrupting, which was something Cyrus had always been able to do. When I finished, he wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the table for a moment. "You proved you're not an anchor," he said. "You proved it to yourself, to Marin, to 200 clients and 140 drivers." He looked up at me. "So why are you still quiet?" "Because if I say it," I told him, "it becomes about me. It becomes about proving something to one man in a room. And if the truth comes out on its own, if the world sees it without me having to announce it, then it's just the truth. No argument. No performance." Cyrus turned his mug in a slow circle on the table. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "That's either the wisest thing I've ever heard or the loneliest." I told him it was probably both. He nodded once and poured me more coffee. The subject didn't come up again that visit, but I drove home thinking about the word he'd used. Lonely. Not wrong. Not right. Just accurate. In the fall of 2024, Marin made the threat explicit. We were in my office, late afternoon, the light coming through the west-facing window at a low angle that made the room feel smaller than it was. She had printed something and set it on my desk. It was a copy of an invitation Sterling's graduation celebration at the Meridian Club in Hoboken, December 14th. Garrett Crane, hosting. Sterling Crane, honored guest. "I know what your father is planning to announce," she said. "I know about the trust. I know about the property in Summit. I know about the VP position." She paused. "I know because Decker mentioned it on a call last week. Proud as anything, like it was good news for all of us." I looked at the invitation. "If you don't say something before that night," she said, "I will say it at that night." I looked up at her. "Then say it." She went very still. "You're not going to stop me?" "No," I said. "You don't care?" "I care," I said, "but not the way you mean. I've never needed him to say my name in a room. I needed to know I could build something real. I know that now. I've known it for 4 years." I looked back at the invitation. "But you've been waiting longer than I have. You've been carrying this with me since the first yard, since the second truck, since the first time Crane Industrial's name showed up in our system, and you looked at me and didn't say a word, because I asked you not to. That's not nothing. Marin, that's everything." She didn't answer right away. "You trusted me when you had no reason to," I said. I'm not going to tell you what to do with that now. Do what you know is right. The office was quiet. Outside, I could hear a truck engine turning over in the yard, that specific sound, that low mechanical certainty that I had learned to love before I knew I was learning it. Marin picked up her copy of the invitation. She folded it once, carefully, along the original crease, and put it in her jacket pocket. She didn't say anything else. She walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame, and stood there for a moment without turning around. Then she left. I sat in my office until the light through the west window was gone. I didn't call anyone. I didn't write anything down. I had learned, a long time ago, that some things don't need to be recorded. Some things just need to be lived through, and then they become permanent on their own. 2 weeks later, she walked into the Meridian Club. I was already in the back row. The room was the kind of room that believed in itself. Dark paneling, brass fixtures, portraits of men who had accomplished things in industries that no longer existed the way they used to. The Meridian Club on Hudson Street had hosted 3 generations of Newark's commercial class, and it knew how to dress an occasion. The tables were set with white linen and small arrangements of white flowers I couldn't name. There were perhaps 60 people seated when I came in through the side entrance, and another dozen or so standing near the bar at the far end, holding drinks they weren't really drinking. I had worn the gray jacket. I don't know why that detail matters, but it does. Hollis was already there. He had found a chair in the last row, not the last table, the last actual row of chairs along the back wall, where the light from the chandeliers didn't quite reach. He was sitting the way he always sits when he's decided something very still, hands loose in his lap, watching the room the way he used to watch dispatch boards when we were both figuring out how freight moved and why it didn't. He had a glass of water on the floor beside his chair. He hadn't touched it. Garrett Crane was at the front of the room near a small raised platform. He was talking to a man I recognized from the Crane Industrial Board, Arthur Pell, their CFO, the same Arthur Pell whose signature appeared on 47 invoices in the folder I was carrying in my bag. Garrett looked comfortable. He looked like a man who had arranged something he was proud of and was waiting to be witnessed. Sterling was nearby, in a suit that had been fitted recently, standing with 2 men his age who laughed at the right intervals. Sterling had his father's posture, shoulders back. Chin slightly elevated, the posture of a man who has been told, from a young age, that the room is his. I set my bag on the floor near the entrance and looked across the room at Hollis. He didn't look at me. He was watching his father. The dinner portion had already ended. The plates were being cleared. Someone was adjusting a microphone at the front. I had timed it this way. I had not come for the dinner. Garrett Crane moved to the platform at 8:17. I know because I checked my watch. He thanked the room for being there. He talked about the company 41 years, 2 recessions, the expansion into coatings for maritime infrastructure, the contracts that had taken them from a regional business to something with national reach. He was a good speaker. He believed what he was saying, which always helps. People were nodding. Arthur Pell was nodding. Sterling was nodding with the particular patience of a man who knows the applause is coming and is waiting for his name. Then Garrett said Sterling's name. He talked about Harvard. He talked about Sterling's thesis on industrial supply chain restructuring. I noted the phrase, filed it away, and about what Sterling had demonstrated in the 2 years since graduation: leadership, vision, an instinct for the business. He said the word future 3 times. He announced the VP position at Crane Industrial. He announced the property on Kingsbridge Avenue, a house I knew cost approximately $1.8 million based on the county records I had pulled the previous Thursday. He announced the Tesla, which was parked outside and which several people had apparently already seen because there was a small wave of knowing laughter from the crowd. The room applauded. Sterling accepted it graciously. Garrett put his arm around his younger son and said something quietly that made Sterling smile. Then Garrett said one more thing. He said it the way a man says something he believes is a compliment to the room, a grace note, a small additional proof of his own good judgment. He said, and I'll tell you what else gives me confidence in Sterling's future at Crane Industrial. We finally got our logistics right. 4 years ago, I was ready to fire the whole freight department. Now we have a carrier ironclad out of Newark that runs like a machine. On-time delivery, no claims disputes, clean invoicing. That's the kind of operational foundation Sterling is inheriting. That's what good leadership looks like. You find the right people, and you keep them. Several people nodded. Arthur Pell nodded. Someone near the bar said, "Here, here." I did not look at Hollis. I could not look at Hollis. I was standing near the entrance with my bag on the floor, and I was looking at the floor, and I was counting something, I don't know what. Seconds maybe, or the number of times a man can be made invisible by the same person in the same room, and I understood, in that moment, that I had been wrong about the timing. I had thought I was waiting for the right moment. The right moment had just passed, and left something worse in its place. Garrett Crane had just praised his son's company to a room full of people, in front of his son, without knowing his son was there or that the company was his. He had held up the work as evidence of someone else's future. He had used it as a gift. I picked up my bag. I looked at the back row. Hollis had not moved. His hands were still loose in his lap. His face was the same as it had been when I walked in the same careful stillness he had learned. I think, not in any boardroom, but in years of watching dispatchers and brokers and freight managers talk past him about things he understood better than they did. He had spent a long time in rooms where people spoke over him. He had learned to let them. I picked up my bag. I want to be accurate about what I was feeling as I walked toward the front of that room. It was not anger, or not only anger. It was something closer to the feeling I had the first morning Ironclad cleared its first $100,000 month, when Hollis showed me the numbers and didn't say anything for a long time, just looked at them. There was something in that silence that I had never been able to let go of. 4 years of it. 4 years of watching him build something real and precise and genuinely valuable, while the man who called him an anchor stood 40 miles away and wrote checks to Ironclad Logistics without ever once asking who owned it. I was not going to let that be the end of the sentence. I walked past 3 tables. I was aware of people noticing me. The room had the particular attention of a crowd that has just finished applauding and doesn't know what comes next. Garrett Crane saw me when I was perhaps 15 feet away. He didn't recognize me immediately. I had met him once, briefly, at a freight conference in 2019, but we had not spoken at length, and I was not the kind of person he would have filed away. I stopped near the edge of the platform. I spoke clearly, at a volume that carried without being theatrical. "Mr. Crane, I need to say something to everyone in this room. Ironclad Logistics, your best logistics provider, the one that handles all primary freight movement for Crane Industrial, is owned by Hollis Crane, your son." The room did not erupt. It went quiet in a specific way, the way a room goes quiet when something has been said that people need a moment to process before they can react. Garrett Crane looked at me with an expression that was not yet understanding. It was the face of a man who has heard a sentence but hasn't yet decided what it means. He said, "I'm sorry, what?" I said it again. I said it the same way, the same pace, the same volume. Hollis Crane owns Ironclad Logistics. He is the sole owner. His operating alias in the contracts is Asa Trumbull. Ironclad is the only logistics provider Crane Industrial has used for primary freight since 2021. $2.1 million per year, 4 years, $8.4 million total, paid by your company to a business your son built. Sterling had turned. He was looking at me with an expression I recognized. It was the expression of a person who is calculating whether to be angry or afraid and hasn't yet decided. He said, "That's not true. That's Asa Trumbull. Asa Trumbull is a sales director. He's been in the contracts for years. I opened my bag. I had organized the documents the same way I organize route manifests by date, by reference number, with tabs. I set 3 items on the nearest table where the room could see them. The original contract from 2021 signed by Asa Trumbull on behalf of Ironclad Logistics, with Hollis's actual signature on the operating agreement attached as Exhibit A. The payment ledger from Crane Industrial's own accounts payable records, which Arthur Pell had filed with the county as part of a routine financial disclosure the previous year, and a chain of internal emails from Crane Industrial's procurement team, including one from Arthur Pell himself, dated March of 2023, in which he referred to Asa Trumbull as, I read the line aloud, the most reliable logistics contact we've worked with in 15 years. Arthur Pell, who was standing 6 feet from me, said nothing. He looked at the documents the way Patricia had looked at the amended will, slowly, carefully, with the expression of a man who is very good at his job and is now doing it in real time. Garrett Crane said, "Why didn't he tell me?" He said it quietly, not to me, not to the room, to the air in front of him, in the particular tone of a question a person asks when they already know it isn't going to have a comfortable answer. I said, "Because he didn't build Ironclad to be recognized by you. He built it to survive. He built it because you told him he was an anchor, and he decided to find out what that actually meant. An anchor isn't useless. Mr. Crane. An anchor is what keeps everything else from drifting. That's what Hollis has been doing for 4 years, keeping Crane Industrial from drifting, while you gave Sterling a Tesla." The room was very quiet. Garrett Crane sat down. He sat down the way a man sits when his legs have made the decision before his mind has. His face had changed, not all at once, but the way a surface changes when the thing underneath it shifts. He looked older than he had looked 12 minutes ago on that platform. He looked at his hands, then at the documents on the table, then at Arthur Pell, who met his gaze, and then looked away. Sterling said, "Dad, I didn't know about this." His voice was even, but his face was not. His face was the color of the white linen on the table beside him. "I didn't know any of this." Garrett said, "Neither did I." There was a silence that lasted long enough that someone near the bar set down a glass very carefully, and the small sound of it carried across the room. Then Garrett said, almost to himself, he could cancel the contract. Any time he wanted, he could have canceled it the day he signed it. I said, "Yes, he could have. He hasn't." Garrett looked at me for a moment. He looked like he was going to say something else, but he didn't. He looked toward the back of the room. I looked too. Hollis was standing. He had stood at some point in the last minute without my noticing. He had simply risen, the way he does everything, without announcement. He was looking at his father. It was not a long look, and it was not a warm one, but it was not cruel either. It was the look of a man who has spent a great deal of time understanding something and has finally allowed someone else to see that he understands it. He held it for perhaps 4 seconds. Garrett Crane did not look away. Then Hollis picked up the glass of water from the floor beside his chair. He set it on the seat. He straightened his jacket. He walked toward the side exit, the same door I had come through, and he did not hurry. And he did not look back. And the room watched him go in the complete silence of 60 people who have just been shown something they did not expect to see and do not yet know how to name. The door closed behind him. It made almost no sound at all. The door made almost no sound. That was what I kept coming back to, in the weeks and months after. Not the words I had said, not Garrett's face, not Sterling's stillness, but that door, and how quietly it closed, and how the silence that followed it was a different kind of silence than anything that had come before. For a long moment, no one in that room moved. I stood near the side wall where I had delivered the last of it, and I watched 60 people recalibrate. Some of them looked at Garrett. Some of them looked at Sterling. A few of them looked at each other with the particular expression of people trying to determine whether what they had just witnessed was planned, whether this was some kind of corporate presentation, a staged reveal, a surprise announcement dressed up as a family celebration. One man near the back, a business associate of Garrett's I recognized from a trade conference 2 years earlier, actually began to applaud before the woman beside him touched his arm, and he stopped. Garrett Crane stood at the front of the room with the microphone still in his hand. He set it down on the podium. He did not tap it. He did not check if it was still on. He set it down the way you set something down when you no longer remember why you were holding it. Sterling had not moved from his chair at the head table. The Tesla key fob was still on the tablecloth in front of him. He was looking at the door through which Hollis had left, and his face had the quality of a man doing arithmetic he had not expected to be asked to do. I left the room through the same side exit. I did not stay to watch what came next. I had seen enough, and there are things that belong to a family even when that family has failed itself, and I was not part of what was going to happen in the next 10 minutes. I had done what I came to do. I walked to my car in the parking structure on the second level, and I sat there for a while before I started the engine. What I know about what followed, I know from 3 sources: a call from Sterling 2 days later, a call from Garrett's CFO the following week, and a conversation with Hollis himself, which came much later and which he kept brief. Garrett called his CFO before he left the venue. The CFO's name is Raymond Chu, and he has been with Crane Industrial for 11 years. And when I spoke to him later briefly, professionally, he told me that Garrett had called him at 9:47 that evening and said, without preamble, that he needed to know everything about ironclad logistics. Not the contract terms, which Garrett already had access to, everything. The ownership structure, the financials, the history. Raymond told him. Then Garrett asked, "How much does ironclad depend on us?" Raymond said, "Sir, that's not quite the right question." Garrett said, "Then what is the right question?" Raymond said, "The right question is how much do we depend on them? And the answer is if ironclad terminates the contract tomorrow, Crane Industrial loses 15% of annual revenue within 90 days. And if we move to an alternative provider at current market rates, our logistics costs increase by approximately 40%. We looked at this last spring when we were renegotiating. There is no equivalent provider in the Newark-Elizabeth corridor at the volume and reliability ironclad delivers." Garrett did not respond for a moment. Then he said, "How long have we been in contract with them?" Raymond said, 4 years, sir." Garrett called Hollis 5 times that night. The first call was at 10:12. The last was at 11:49. Hollis did not answer any of them. He did not send a text. He did not have his assistant respond. He simply did not answer, and the not answering was its own kind of statement, not hostile, not dramatic, just the simple fact of a man who had spent 4 years deciding what he owed and to whom, and had already made his accounting. Garrett called again 3 days later. This time, Hollis picked up. He told me about the call in pieces, the way he tells most things. He said Garrett spoke first, and that what Garrett said was not what he had expected. His father did not ask for an explanation. He did not try to renegotiate the history. He said, and Hollis repeated this to me slowly, as if he was still deciding what to do with the words, "I called you an anchor. I said it like it meant you were a problem. I was wrong about what it meant. I was wrong about a lot of what I thought I knew." Hollis said he did not respond right away. He was in his car, in the ironclad yard, watching a driver run a pre-trip inspection on a Freightliner in Bay 2. He watched the driver work through the checklist tires, lights, coupling the way Cyrus had taught him to watch things fully without rushing to the next part. Then he said, "I know, Dad." Not "I forgive you." Not "it's okay." Not "we're fine." Just "I know." Garrett said, "Is that enough?" Hollis said, "I don't know yet, but it's a start." He hung up and sat in the car for a while. He did not call me. He did not call Cyrus. He just sat there in the yard he had built, watching the truck pull out of Bay 2 and turn toward the gate, its headlights coming on as it reached the street. Sterling called me on a Tuesday. He had gotten my number from the Ironclad website, which I found both logical and quietly painful. He was polite. He sounded like someone who had not slept well in 2 days, which I suspected was accurate. He said he wanted me to know that he hadn't known about Ironclad, about the contract, about any of it. He said he knew that probably didn't change much, but he wanted to say it to someone who might pass it along. I told him I believed him. He said I told my father I don't want the Tesla. I don't want the mansion. Not like this. I asked him what his father said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said it was too late. And then he said, Sterling paused here. He said, I know you didn't know. I was the one who didn't know. And he walked out of the room. And I haven't spoken to him since. I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't much to say. Sterling thanked me for my time and hung up. He sounded, at the end of the call, very young. He is 26 years old and he has a Harvard degree, and a father who spent 15 years making him the center of a story that turned out to have a different protagonist entirely. That is not nothing to carry. Hollis's mother called him the night of the party. Her name is Diane, and she has lived in Montclair for the 10 years since the divorce, and Hollis calls her every Sunday without exception. He told me this once, not as a detail about himself, but as a detail about her. She always picks up on the second ring, he said, because she's always already near the phone when he calls. She called him that night, and he answered on the first ring. She said, I am proud of you. I want you to know that. I have always been proud of you. He said, I know, Mom. That was most of what he told me about that call. I did not ask for more. Cyrus Walden called the next morning. Hollis put him on speaker while he was driving, which is the only way Cyrus will allow himself to be discussed in motion. He always said, things make more sense. Cyrus told him he had done it, that he had proven what he needed to prove. Hollis said, I didn't do it to prove anything. Cyrus said, I know. That's why it worked. Hollis said I did it because Murrin was going to do it with or without me, and I wanted to be in the room. Cyrus laughed. It was the kind of laugh that takes a long time to earn. 3 months after the party, Hollis's attorney sent a contract renewal to Crane Industrial's procurement office. The new rate was $3.2 million per year, up from $2.1. The terms were otherwise identical. There was no letter attached, no explanation, no negotiation opening, just the contract. Garrett signed it within the week. He did not call Hollis to discuss it. Hollis did not call him. The contract was processed through the standard procurement channels, countersigned by Raymond Chew, and filed. Ironclad's trucks continued to run the Newark-Elizabeth corridor on the same schedule they had run for 4 years. The loads were the same. The delivery windows were the same. Nothing visible changed. I went to the Ironclad office on a Friday in February, 3.5 months after the party. I had paperwork to review with Hollis, a new carrier agreement, nothing dramatic, and we worked through it at the table in his office that looks out over the yard where the Freightliners stage before their morning runs. When we were done, I gathered my copies and I was about to stand up when I noticed the photograph on his desk. It has been there since the first day I walked into that office, 7 years ago, and I have looked at it many times without asking about it. A boy, maybe 9 years old, standing in front of what looks like a backyard fence. He is grinning. It is the kind of grin that does not know yet what is coming. I did not ask about it this time either. I picked up my folder. Hollis was looking out the window at the yard. The first trucks were beginning to pull out, their headlights still on in the February gray. He watched them the way he always watches them, not with satisfaction exactly, and not with pride exactly, but with the attention of a man who understands the weight of what is moving and what it takes to keep it moving. He did not look at the photograph. He did not need to. I was still at the table when Hollis's phone buzzed on the desk between us. He glanced at the screen. I saw his jaw shift not much, just enough. He set the phone face down, the way he always does when he wants to think before he responds. Then he picked it up again. He looked at the screen for a moment. He did not answer, but he did not turn it over. He set it down, face up, and let it ring through. Outside, the last Freightliner of the morning run cleared the gate and turned south on Freilinghuisen. Its taillights disappeared into the February gray. Hollis watched it go. I gathered my folder and did not say anything, because there was nothing left to say that the morning hadn't already said for us.